A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You know, while dramas continue to unfold around the delays for a Gaza ceasefire agreement, there appears to be a major development that we want to unpack today. You know, the magnitude of the October 7 incident appears to have led to a shift in Israeli sentiment against the idea of a two-state solution. Now, our special guest today says a two-state solution is a flawed concept that has only served to empower those who wish to destroy Israel. Stan Goodenough is back with us. He's in Australia bringing historical context to the concept of that two-state solution that you've been hearing about and its origins. Stan Goodenough is an independent journalist known as a Jerusalem Watchman. He's here in Australia talking to audiences and meeting with political leaders about developments around the nation of Israel and looking to enhance the long-standing friendship between Australia and Israel. Stan Goodenough, an absolute pleasure to have you sitting with me in the studio today. Welcome.
Shalom, Neil. It's really good to be here. Thank you.
Stan, it's a little while since you were in Australia last, but here you are. It is a favourite stamping ground for you for meeting with people all over the country. This particular tour, give us a little insight what you're doing while you're here.
All right, it wasn't that long ago that I was here. It was, in fact, 10 months ago that I came through the country, and I did a literally corner-to-corner speaking tour of Australia, mostly to Christian audiences. And this was obviously post October the 7th, post the day of the massacre and the beginning of the still ongoing war. And the purpose of that visit, which was also triggered by the eruption of anti-Semitism down in Australia the day after the massacre, was to get Christians mainly to recognize that this nation, which has had such an incredibly positive relationship with both the nascent Jewish state leading up to its birth and then since its birth, an ally of Israel's and also haven for Holocaust survivors, perhaps more than any other English-speaking country. But everything changed on October the 7th in both directions regarding Israel. By then, the Australian government had moved quite considerably away from its long-standing alliance with Israel into almost the enemy camp. And then, of course, the Jewish people here who were suddenly confronted with the fact that they were not safe in Australia anymore.
Well, there's so much to unpack, even in those opening comments that you've made there, that Australia had been typically a haven of refuge for people who were Holocaust survivors. So when we think of the Jewish population in Australia, it's substantial. And we've been talking many years now about a rising anti-Semitism. But that October 7 event, that attack, and then the subsequent rallies that were held here and a revival of anti-Semitism, you might say, in a more significant way. What are your thoughts about that October 7 attack and how that may have affected here in Australia? Maybe what was a latent anti-Semitism that was rising to the surface?
Neil, when I first came to your country in 2014, there had been an IDF operation into Gaza following the kidnapping and murder of 3 Jewish boys. And on the plane down here, it was my very first visit. I was coming to your country and to New Zealand. On the plane down here, I picked up a copy of, I think, the Sydney Morning Herald they had on the plane. And I read that Jews in New Zealand, 80% of them were hiding their Jewishness immediately following Israel's entry into Gaza. This is 2014, because they were afraid of a backlash. And what we've always seen is that when Israel, the Israeli army, the Israel Defense Forces, when they move to secure Israel against threat, that ignites anti-Semitism all over the world. Now, what happened on October the 7th was a shock of such massive proportions that tipped the entire nation into trauma. But what happened the next day with the event, not just in Sydney, but also in New York and in London and others, where the police forces stood to the side and allowed mobs to rampage or to march through the streets calling death to the Jews, death to Israel, shocking the Israelis, who were looking around for some kind of response, supportive response to the horrors of the massacre, and we hadn't even got the numbers yet. We didn't even know how many had been kidnapped. And yet, this is what ignited. It was like there were petrol fumes around the world, and they all just ignited.
When we talk about the response, we're talking a response from authorities like our police as to what sort of policy they might have in place to be able to deal with those sorts of things. And then we look to our political leaders to make a quick response on those things. And there's been a lot of criticism for our Australian government that they did not respond more quickly. Now, I know that you, in your latest articles, suggest that Australia's relationship with Israel has been sliding. How steep is that slide? Don't hold back here. I know you want to talk about these sorts of things, and you might be wanting to be very diplomatic, but we're all interested in what this perception is that's coming from Israel about the sliding relationship. We've always had such a strong relationship.
Well, I appreciate that you give me the platform, and I'm glad that you release me, because I realize I'm talking to Aussies about the Australian position, and I'm not an Australian. So I'll put it this way, and it's shockingly simple. In 2014, when I came here, you had a Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. He had positioned Australia so firmly behind Israel. Julie Bishop, who was your foreign minister then, had taken a strong supportive stand even with Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria. There was no other country in the Western world that was as strongly aligned with with Israel as Australia. 10 years later, 11 years later, the Prime Minister of Israel calls your Prime Minister anti-Semitic. Israelis start seeing Australia now as an enemy, not a friend, because under the last three governments, not just the current one, but the slide which began when Tony Abbott was removed, the country has shifted from a very strong pro-Israel position.
Let me just pause for a moment here, because when you say that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu actually labels our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese as anti-Semitic, now, I'm not sure where all of that went under the radar here in Australian media, but that's something that you've picked up in international media, those sorts of releases. You spend a lot of time in Israel. You monitor these things carefully. So Benjamin Netanyahu actually makes a public statement calling our Australian Prime Minister anti-Semitic.
I will just hold back. He maybe didn't mention him by name, but he said the leadership of Australia is anti-Semitic, and that the Australian government was anti-Semitic by its lack of response to the anti-Semitism here, and by joining the international call for example for Prime Minister Netanyahu to in fact be arrested if he comes here to be taken to the International Court, Criminal Court in The Hague.
So let's come back to this slide. When I say how steep is this slide, how far have we fallen from former governments to the present government?
Well, that former government, the one of Tony Abbott, and this is also a reality that I was not tuned into Australia's relationship with Israel, and even the background of how Australia's national contribution to the rebirth of Israel had been so major. That was a relatively new revelation to me after 2010. And then I went in and began to study and learn a bit about how Australia had been almost a midwife. And I know this is a bit of a different term, that one doesn't usually apply this to World War I, but Australia had played a midwife's job in helping to rebirth Israel, which was a dead nation, a scattered nation, that is. They had no land, and they, of course, had lost their language, and they were all over the world. Now they're coming back to the land in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And Australia is at the point of the spear that will drive out the Ottoman Empire. As part of the British Empire, I understand that, and the New Zealanders were fully involved as well. But somehow, looking back in that history, it's as if God said Australia is going to be the spear point that pushes out this Islamic control that has been present in the land for 700 years and frees the land up so that the Jews who are beginning to come home will be able to form their state. So in that sense, Australia is even playing a midwife's role in a prophetic development, the major prophetic development of our time.
A midwife role in what was the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And I know listeners, many will be familiar with the light horse and the the emancipation of Beersheba. And that was creating the way forward for the recognition of a state of Israel. We're going to talk some more about some of these sorts of things, but let's talk quickly about the two-state solution, because a lot of listeners will be thinking, isn't this something that has generational validity? You've got a context in mind here. Where does all this come from, the thoughts of a two-state solution?
Well, the current term was put back into circulation by George W. Bush in 2002. That's 10 full years after the Oslo Agreement was signed. The Oslo Agreement, signed between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organizations, Yasser Arafat, was supposed to begin the process towards this two-state solution, whereby Israel would release land or pull out of territory that it was in control of and hand it over to the PLO. And the PLO on its side would stop terrorism, stop inciting violence, and change its charter, which calls for the destruction of Israel. That's the Land for Peace process. And George W., he spoke at the General Assembly in 2002. He spoke about this as the two-state solution. But the British Empire, the Mandate authorities actually, had put forward the two-state solution first way back in 1937. Their very first two-state solution was rolled out then. Divide this piece of land west of the Jordan River between Jews and Arabs. The Jews accepted, the Arabs rejected. A year or two later, the second two-state solution was proposed by the British. It was once again accepted by the Jews, rejected by the Arabs, and then another third two-state solution before World War II was rolled out. And it was rolled out in response to the Arab violent rejection of Jewish immigration. That's what led to it. And this is where Palestinian nationalism comes from. A rejectionism, violently, through pogroms and massacres, of Jewish immigration to the land so that the Balfour Declaration could come into realization. So the two-state solution is actually a tried and repeatedly failed approach to trying to bring peace between Jew and Arab west of the Jordan River.
A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316, and I'd like to say no holds barred in a conversation that we're having with our special guest today. We might have, maybe there's a few things if someone comes up with something we might not be able to talk about it, but you might have your own comment. You might have a question. Today is a good day to ask those questions about the Jewish state, Israel, about the Palestinian cause. You can call us on 1800 316 316. Let's take a call straight away. Philip is in Exmouth in Western Australia. Hey, Philip, thanks so much for calling.
Yeah, good morning. So my question is, the verses in the Bible that talk about I'll put a thorn in their side, and also I will make them jealous by a nation that is not a nation. So I suppose my question is God using like the British going back in history and this proposal for a Palestinian state within Israel, in the side of Israel? You look at it, it's long and thin, Gaza, and is God using it to bring the Jewish people back to himself and recognition of Jesus as their very own Messiah?
Philip, good question. Stan?
That is a good question. Thank you for asking it. Let me say it this way. The ultimate plan of God, as told by Moses and all the prophets, concerning the restoration of the Jews to their land in the end of days. That journey, which begins with, in sense, a political movement, the political movement of Zionism, where Jews, some of them who are devout, God-fearing, and others who are not, come streaming back to the land of Israel, mostly fleeing persecution. Anti-Semitism has been the main motivator for Jewish immigration to Israel. And they come back in all kinds of different conditions. Some of them are, as I said, very, very devout. They're practicing their faith. Others are very secular. But the Bible is clear that their physical return to the land is going to be followed by their spiritual restoration as a complete nation to God. And there are numerous verses in which God promises that he will cleanse Israel, the land of Israel, of all of its sin, all of its unrighteousness. And he will do so quickly, rapidly. He says at one point in a single day. He will say the cleansing will be so complete that the iniquity of Israel will be sought but will not be found. That's the ultimate destination. Is he using the conflict? God uses everything. He uses politics, he uses geopolitics, he uses war. He used the Australian light horse in war to liberate Beersheba and then Jerusalem and then to drive the Turks out over the Golan Heights. God uses war. He uses the enemies of Israel to get them to cry out to him. And we have many accounts, even from some of the hostages who've come out of the tunnels, of how they have been drawn closer to God in this excruciating, tormenting experience that Israel is going through.
Philip, anything further to add?
Yeah, look, thank you. Thank you. I absolutely hear all that and I agree with you. Just I think that hopefully that complete restoration is sooner rather than later. I just don't know whether it's before where the rapture and then the permanent return of Jesus happens and where Israel complete falls into all that.
Stan, anything further to contribute there as Philip's made that thought?
Well, I'm going to back out of it simply because the end time questions that relate to the rapture, tribulation, the Antichrist, and so on, generally cause more, shall we say, friendly disagreement among Christians than they lead to a clear answer. And I have my own particular understanding of how things are going to play out, and they differ in many ways from many of my fellow believers. So rather than get into the controversies that surround that, I will just say this. God has promised to bring them home and keep them as a shepherd keeps his sheep, to plant them in the land with all of his heart and with all of his soul, and to restore them as a nation to himself. And how that lines up with the exact coming, the time the Messiah will return, or as the Jewish people believe will come for the first time, same Messiah, just a different understanding, I believe. That I'm not into predicting, but I see that we're very close. The very intensity of the current conflict points to the coming of the King.
Philip, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316 to join in our conversation. We've got an upcoming election here, a federal election, and I can't help coming back to, and, this is a politicised conversation because we're talking global politics. We'll get on to what Donald Trump might be in the whole mix here and a two-state solution, those sorts of things. But we've got an upcoming election here in Australia. And when you've got references to our own government being classified as anti-Semitic, with quite a major campaign, as I understand it, in the Jewish media in Israel. Could it be, do you think, a turning point for Australia in this friendship with Israel? If our friendship is diminishing, is a change of government likely to be a restoration of that friendship?
I would certainly hope so, Neil, and I know that many in Israel are hoping that there will be a turnaround because of the direction the current government has gone in. But it does kind of all come down laser sharp to the whole question of the two-state solution. What happened in Israel on October the 7th evaporated all support for the two-state solution in Israel. There is no support in Israel for the two-state solution except on the very fringe. The country, the parliament, the government, the prime minister, they've all said no two-state solution, no Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. But at the very same time, almost every nation on earth is now poised, and there's a conference coming up in June that's going to speak directly to this, poised to set in stone the two-state solution as the only way forward, which means that come June this year, whoever is in your political leadership will be representing your country at this conference on June the 2nd, which is right after your elections, and Australia will decide then whether it joins this wall-to-wall irreversible, in the words of Antony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, an irreversible setting into motion the path towards a two-state solution, which Israel now says is a no-go. So now you have Israel on one side and virtually the entire world on the other. Where will Australia stand? And as you've referenced just a moment ago, perhaps that'll be guided by where Donald Trump will stand on this question.
Let's talk Trump. Let's talk U.S. administration, because Mike Huckabee, who's the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, when he was asked, you say this in your article, Whether Trump supports the two-state solution, the answer was a very firm and emphatic no.
Mike Huckabee spoke just in the week before the inauguration. He was interviewed on Fox News, and he was asked whether Donald Trump would recognize the two-state, or would go along with the two-state solution. And his response was, listen, he used the term we, which made me smile. He said, we gave Gaza to the Palestinian Arabs in 2005 when Israel pulled all of the Jews out and closed the gates and pulled their forces out and handed over that land. He said, look where that got us. We gave them land to start their state. Look where that got us. It got us to October the 7th. So his words with the two-state solution is a dead. I'm not quoting him directly, but that's what he said. This is a no-go. So he inferred that Donald Trump will not. But as we're sitting here right now, Neil, last night, local time, Donald Trump gave his big address on Capitol Hill, and he made virtually no reference to the two-state solution, although we were all anticipating that he would. So we don't yet know where he stands.
The interesting thing is there's such a prevailing, I guess you'd call it a confusion over this idea of a two-state solution, as somehow or other it's been Israel and the allies that have been the blockage to that. But this two-state solution has been a live concept, as you say, for many generations, but it's the Palestinians themselves, the Arabs themselves, who don't believe in the two-state solution. Just a little short while up to the news, what's the reason, do you think, Stan, that the Palestinians would certainly not accept a two-state solution?
Because whether it's Hamas or Fatah, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, they're all subscribed to a plan that was drafted by the Palestine National Council in 1987 in Cairo, in which they said the two-state solution is a no-go. I'm not quoting them, but that's what they said. Our interest, whether we're Hamas or Fatah or whatever we are, our interest is only this: the destruction of the state of Israel and the establishment of one state, Palestine, from the river to the sea.
Stan, the article that you've written and that, where some of our conversation is based around some of the comments that you've made there, how can listeners access a copy of this article? Just remind us the title of it and where they might be able to find it.
The title is, it's the two-state solution, stupid. And that's taken from a reference put forward in one of the previous American elections, where people were wondering what is the main topic of focus that should guide our voting. And it was put out there, it was the economy stupid. Well, in this instance, I've headlined this article, it's the two-state solution stupid. No offense to anybody, but that has been, it's running for 120 years now already, that has been the goal of Israel's Arab enemies, supported by the entire Arab League, and at the front of that conflict, the Palestine Liberation Organization. That's where they're headed. So the article is in Christians for Israel, the bi-monthly newspaper that comes out here in Australia. It's towards the end of that paper. It was the February edition, so it's just come out, and you can find it there.
Stan, a very important thing that you have been involved in while you've been here on this visit in Australia. You've been meeting with political leaders, and you've even delivered a letter from the Israeli Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, to our Australian parliamentarians. There might be a bit of background to share here, but this letter, tell us about it.
Thank you, Neil. So in its essence, the letter is an appeal, not by the Knesset itself, but by members of the Knesset. In fact, 8 parties signed onto this letter. It's appealing to their partners in Australia, MPs here, to please cease and desist from all support for the two-state solution. And it spells out why. The background to this is follows a meeting I had in the Knesset with one of the parliamentarians there. His name is Ohad Tal. I went there a week before I came to Australia, and I explained to him that one of the reasons that your political parties support the two-state solution is because many in Israel used to support the idea. The people of Israel are desperate for peace, and they have tried everything and agreed to almost every plan put forward, especially since 1991. But every effort by Israel to meet the Palestinian side along this two-state solution track has only led to more violence. And in a very short sketch of history, the whole Palestinian national movement was formed in violence, birthed in violence, first against Israel's rebirth, and since 1948, designed to erase that rebirth, to remove Israel from the Middle East. That is at the heart of Palestinian nationalism, no matter which faction under that umbrella supports or stands in the situation. Now, Israel has been negotiating with the Palestine Liberation Organization since 1991. And many wanted the two-state solution to work. But it led first to the Second Intifada and then to October the 7th. Now the people of Israel know there is no longer a two-state solution practically possible. There's no way to peace down that road. And these parliamentarians have written a letter explaining to and asking your politicians, explaining the fact that the two-state solution is in fact an existential threat to Israel, that the creation of a Palestinian state will lead to the destruction of Israel. And that's based on history. That's not propaganda. That's based on a long, long historical record. And asking any and all Israeli politicians to please distance themselves from and cease from supporting the two-state solution. That's the nature of the letter, which they drafted, gave to me, and I brought down with me and have handed to a number of your members of parliament.
And what sort of reaction did you get? And give us an insight too into what's in the letter that we could perceive here as the most important thing that you delivered as this message from those 8 members of the Knesset.
So the thrust is in the very middle of the letter. First of all, these 8 members of Knesset from different parties, they're sending this as a letter of congratulation for the relaunching of the Australia-Israel Allies Caucus, which took place 3 weeks ago in Canberra. And they addressed the letter to the member for Fraser up on the Sunshine Coast. His name is Andrew Wallace, who is the chairman of this caucus, and to all the other members. And I believe there are about 35 MPs who have signed on to this and are part of this caucus. The letter is, first of all, congratulations for the launching of the caucus, and then an expression of concern about the deterioration in relations between Israel and Australia over the last years, and especially against the anti-Semitism that has erupted in Australia. The heart of the letter, however, is an appeal to cease support for the two-state solution. In the words in the center of the letter, these men write, especially since the October 7th massacre, it is clear that the creation of a Palestinian state would mean the destruction of the state of Israel. They go on to say that a Palestinian state would serve the sole defining anti-Semitic goal of Palestinian nationalism, the eradication of the Jewish state. And they ask, and they call on Australia's politicians to, rather than pursue this tried and failed policy of a two-state solution, to come up with something positive, something that supports Israel's right to their land. And they say, ahead of the federal elections in Australia, we call on the various political parties to remove the two-state paradigm from their party platforms. This move would send a strong message of support and friendship to Israel and to Jewish Australians. It would also express a commitment to common sense, justice, and peace in Israel and the region. So that's the content of the letter, and it, as I said, it was circulated, it was handed to in the region of 35 members of parliament a couple of weeks ago.
And that refiring up of this alliance, the Israel and Australia alliance, it had been allowed to slip? It had stagnated somehow?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that happened, but I do know that when it was originally in its existence, there are two different kinds. There's the Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group. That's something else. That tends to be kind of fairly diplomatic. And then this caucus, the Australia-Israel Allies Caucus, is much more strongly supportive of the Israeli government and its position on the question of the land and the conflict against against Palestinian nationalism. And it had been allowed to slip. I'm not sure of the reasons why, but the relaunch that took place 3 weeks ago, it was attended by, according to Mr. Wallace, more MPs came to that caucus than to any other caucus launch than to any other caucus he had participated in the last 9 years.
And just a reminder, Talkback line open on 1-800-316-316. Come back to this two-state solution terminology, Stan, and the alignment of this two-state solution terminology to what we might all be disturbed by from back at the Holocaust days of a final solution. Some suggestion that the two-state solution has become another way of saying final solution. And is that a relevant thing, or has that emerged somehow?
Yeah, it has certainly emerged, and I think if you're Jewish, you'd understand it instantly. for the last 2,000 years, there have been a lot of solutions put forward to end the Jewish issue, the question of Jewish existence. It played out in so many different eras in history, often through people calling themselves Christians, like the Roman Catholic Church, through their Crusaders and the Inquisition and the pogroms in Eastern Europe by Christians once again against Jews. But all these different efforts to eradicate the Jewish presence from the planet came together under Adolf Hitler. And he called his plan the final solution. He thought he would manage to really render them extinct, as Haman tried to do in Persia, as Hadrian tried to do just 100 years after Jesus. He thought he had it down. He was going to establish a museum in memory of the extinct Jewish race that he had wiped out. The Jews know that the world is always trying to come up with a solution to deal with this Jewish issue. Now they're not scattered anymore. Now the Jews have a state. And so the world aligned together against the Jewish state. It resonates very strongly in their ears. This solution, which evidently, by all the evidence of the last 120 years of history, this solution will lead to Israel's destruction. They know that. So yes, people are saying this is another version of the two-state solution. And there's one thing on top of that, if I may. We've heard our prime ministers and presidents say for nearly 80 years, never again will we allow another Holocaust. Holocaust survivors that I've spoken to in Sydney, in Canberra, and in Melbourne, Jews in Melbourne, they believe not since October the 7th, not only that another Holocaust could happen, but in fact that one is going to happen, and that the nations of the world will let it happen, because Israel has become basically indigestible to the world, is a problem.
Wow, that's worthy of pausing and reflecting on very significantly. Come back to the Palestinian Authority for a few moments here, because while we've got Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority and the historic formation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, and there's been a number of different morphing transformations over the years. I wonder if you've got any comment, Stan, on whether the aspirations of all of these organisations that fight on behalf of the Palestinians have changed since the original plans and aspirations of the PLO.
When the PLO was launched in 1964, they drafted a charter. Their charter committed all Palestinian opposition to Israel's presence to the violent removal of Israel. Only violence, not negotiations. They would not recognize Israel. They would not talk to Israel. They had another problem, though, Neil. Nobody in the world cared about the Palestinians. There wasn't a Palestinian cause back then. And the way they got the Palestinian cause onto the international agenda was through terrorism, through hijacking airplanes and killing Israeli athletes at the Olympic Games and assassinating diplomats. And for 10, 12 years from 1970, we learned about international terrorism, which was always carried out by Palestinians, and their goal was to get the whole world on board with their cause. From its inception in pre-Israel Palestine, before 1948, the whole Palestine national movement has followed this one course, but they have changed in this way. When they got together, and Fatah was there, and so was Hamas, and so was all these different 7, 8 different organizations, they all came under the banner of what's called the Palestinian National Council, and they agreed to change the charter in this way. We will now talk to the Jews. We will talk to them, and we'll get what land we can get back through discussions. And we'll get the world on side to support the birth of our state. But when we've got as much land as we can get, and we can't get any more, we will use that land as a platform to launch our final attack against Israel and drive the Jews into the sea and liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. And that is the goal which Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is a misnomer. Arafat, who signed as chairman of the Palestinian Authority, the Oslo Agreement in 1993, he signed it as the chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. We think this Palestinian Authority is some kind of more moderate entity. It is not. It is the PLO, and it still has their goal. Their charter hasn't changed. It is for the destruction of Israel.
We're taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's take a call. Anne is in Labrador. Hey, Anne, welcome.
Hello, how are you? Very windy and rainy down here. Listen, I was just wanting to know, that the war that's been going on with Hamas and all Palestine, with Israel, will that ever cease, or is that just something that is going to be a continuous thing until the Lord comes back again? Because we see that's where the Lord's going to plant his feet, on the Mount of Olives, and when the Gentiles come in, the Jews will come in too. So is this just something that's going to be an ongoing thing, or will there be some sort of peace before that happens?
Stan, thoughts here for Anne?
And hi, we have a biblical position on this. The Bible is very clear. There are two kingdoms in this world, the kingdom of Satan and the coming kingdom of God that will be established on earth as it is in heaven, and the headquarters or the capital of that kingdom is going to be Jerusalem. As you said, that is where the Messiah is coming to. So there is a conflict, and the conflict as believers we see quite clearly as whether it manifests through Hamas in Gaza or through the Palestinian the Palestinian Authority or the PLO, whatever, or even through the State Department, or even through the Iranian pursuit of a nuclear weapon. That's one kingdom coming against the restoration of the kingdom to Israel that the disciples asked Jesus about. If you go to Acts chapter 1, the very last question they asked him is, Lord, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? And he told them, no, that's going to happen in the future. That's not for them to worry about. Charles Spurgeon, who was a wonderful preacher, about 20 years before the Jews began returning to their land, in 1861, he said, they will come back to their land, they will form a political institute, there will be a state, and then the kingdom will come. He understood that this political situation, which is fraught with war and violence, that this is a birthing pang, these are birthing pangs, if you like, leading to the coming of the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And that has to manifest, according to the Bible, through the Jews being back in their land, and the enemy coming against them, and he comes against them on many fronts. This war began before Israel was reborn. There's been a war every decade or less since the creation of the state in 948, and now we're embroiled in yet another conflict. There's no visible sign of an end to it. But what we get from the Bible is that it will end, and my understanding is it will end when the Lord himself will go to battle against these nations that are coming against Israel, whether it's the Palestinians or the Arab world or the Islamic world or the Western world. All those who come against Israel find themselves coming against God, and he says that when they do, he will confront them himself.
Anne in Labrador, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Let me ask you about a biblical prophecy, because while all eyes are on Gaza and phase 2 of a ceasefire agreement and plans to turn it into a Riviera under Donald Trump with all sorts of developments and major hotels and such things, and moving the Palestinian people out of Gaza and rehousing them in other nations. Zephaniah chapter 2, there is a prophecy there that talks about Gaza being emptied. Is there any thought from you on this, Stan? I'm not across this in any sort of significant way, but are you familiar with that particular prophecy?
I've certainly read it, and in the context of Gaza for Donald Trump, or yesterday, the Arab League came together with their own proposal, also using artificial intelligence images to create this paradise in Gaza. That's all happening, and why it's happening the way it is open to discussion. But here's I think a point worth making. Neither Donald Trump nor Israel have called for the forceful expulsion of the people from Gaza. What they've called for is for the world to do what the world did when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. When Putin invaded Ukraine, the whole Western world opened wide its gates, and 3 million Ukrainians were removed from there. They left of their own free will to get out from under the rockets. For all of the weeping buckets of tears for the Palestinian Arabs who are suffering awful suffering in Gaza, no one in the world has said, let's open our doors for the people of Gaza to come to. We had refugees from the Ukraine in my home in Central Europe. They stayed with us for a while, then they went and settled in Berlin. They are now studying at university there. They are being allowed to build their lives there. And millions of Ukrainian refugees are becoming nationals in new countries. That's the idea here. Gaza is a mess. The people are living there. They're living in ruins. These are Arabs. There's a huge Arab world speaking the Arabic language, has lots and lots of land and billions of dollars in oil revenues. They could take those 2 million Arabs out from under those rockets, out from Hamas's clutches, and really give them a new life if they cared for them. But not only do they not care for them enough to offer them to, an entrance, no one in the world, not the Secretary General of the United Nations, no one in the world is putting any pressure on any other nation to help these poor people out from above Hamas and underneath the Israeli response.
Lots we could say more about that, but short of time, let me ask you about the fact that there is a ceasefire at this present moment. But no doubt that's fragile because, as I understand it, Israel is preparing for further conflict. And with the potential to raise up another 400,000 reservists, that might indicate that they're ready for more.
Yes, I think they certainly are. They also have a new chief of staff since yesterday, General Zamir, and he is known to be far harder in terms of how to crush Israel's enemies than the previous chief of staff was. 400,000
reservists?
Thank you, reservists can be called up now. It used to be 350,000. They're not being called up. It's just the law has been changed to allow for that many. But Israel is preparing to go back into Gaza. And Donald Trump this morning gave Israel cover to do so in a strong message to Hamas. He said to them, Hamas, you can end this now. Hand over all the hostages immediately, including the dead bodies, because there's nearly 60 hostages still left and maybe 24 are alive. Hand them all over and get out of Gaza, and the story is over. Otherwise, he said for the third time, otherwise you can expect hell to be unleashed. That's what Trump said this morning.
No doubt there'll be a lot of listeners who might be impressed by the things that they're hearing today and might want to access this article that we've been talking about to get a number of the things that we've been talking about. Not everything, but a number of those issues we've been talking about in this article that Stan has written. It's called It's the Two-State Solution... Stupid. And it's published by Christians for Israel. There is a C4 Israel website that you can simply Google, and you'll find access to that article there. To connect with Stan, he has a website, JerusalemWatchman.org. That's JerusalemWatchman.org. And I think you'll find that the common sense, but also the biblical context is just so powerful in the thoughts of Stan Goodenough. Stan is in Australia. He has delivered a letter from those 8 members of the Knesset to a lot of parliamentary MPs in Canberra. And there's some challenging things that are going on. Stan has his finger on the pulse, and you might want to keep up with those developments because things can change, as we say, daily. JerusalemWatchman.org to connect with our guest, Stan Goodenough. Stan, thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your heart with our listeners today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.